The letter crinkled in Jake Sullivan's hand as his grip tightened. Neon orange ink practically shouted violation notice, remove boat immediately across the top. And beneath it dripped the smug, pseudo-legal tone that only a homeowners association could conjure. Remove the boat from Sullivan Lake within 48 hours or face fines of $500 per day. The words seemed absurd, insulting, and infuriating all at once. It wasn't just paper. It was arrogance made tangible. Jake laughed, but the sound came out harsher than he intended. My boat, my lake. And they think they can find me? He muttered aloud, pacing across the cabin porch. His grandfather's fishing boat bobbed peacefully at the dock, a humble aluminum vessel with weather-kissed paint and decades of memories carved into every bolt. For Jake, it wasn't just a boat. It was legacy. Morning fishing with Grandpa Sullivan, long summer days in cool, clear water, the scent of cedar trees mixing with bass flopping in a wire basket. And now Richard Wilkins and his haughty Maple Creek Estates HOA had the gall to claim it broke community aesthetic guidelines. Community, Jake thought bitterly. Which community? This lake had been Sullivan property since 1953. 6 months earlier, Jake's life could not have been more different. Silicon Valley venture capital calls, cybersecurity startup board meetings, and sleepless nights filled with code and investor demands had once consumed him. The buyout offer had arrived like a golden parachute. More zeros in his checking account than he had ever dreamed of. At 40 years old, financially free but burnt out, Jake had looked at the chaos of the Bay Area and decided he wanted no part of it anymore. Quiet. He needed quiet. That's when he remembered the lake house, Sullivan Lake, 50 acres of glassy fresh water hugged by forests and solitude. His grandfather's place, his family's place. Grandpa Sullivan had always been a fighter, a fisherman, conservationist, and stubborn local legend who once stood up to an entire mining company planning to poison the watershed. Water is life, Jake, his gruff voice often reminded him. Not just for fish, but for all of us. Never let anyone tell you profit outweighs nature. Those words, scrawled deep into Jake's memory, hummed in his ears when he drove east months ago, away from software wars and into pine-lined serenity. He'd restored the cabin with care. Wi-Fi for remote consulting work. Fresh pipes, new windows, but kept the rustic soul intact. Mornings meant steaming coffee on the dock. Evenings meant sunsets reflected in water so still it felt sacred. Until the neon notice snapped him back from paradise. Jake's phone buzzed. Caller ID, Ray Delgado. Ray was his neighbor down the shore, a retired carpenter whose hands were calloused from half a century of hammer and saw. Ray had known Grandpa Sullivan well. The two had fished these waters long before Maple Creek Estates sprouted its sterile luxury developments on the north side. "Morning, Jake," Ray drawled when Jake answered, voice dry with humor. "I see the welcoming committee found you." Jake explained about the notice. Ray's chuckle held no surprise or only weary amusement. Those vultures. They tried once with me, said my shed was unsightly. I told Wilkins he could shove his violation letter where the sun don't shine. They've left me alone since. But your place," Ray paused meaningfully, "your grandfather would have run them off with rock salt." As the day stretched on, Jake did some digging. He pulled up Maple Creek Estates HOA website. There, right on his laptop screen, gleamed smiling photos of Sullivan Lake. The Elite Anglers Club, as they called it, boasted of community-exclusive fishing derbies and splashed images of glitzy weekend warriors grilling fish on what Jake recognized as his eastern shore. Tents, barbecues, flashy fishing vests, even a temporary dock built directly onto his property. Jake's blood pressure spiked with each page click. They had been doing this for years, holding tournaments and parties, writing about Sullivan Lake as their community jewel. The latest post? An upcoming championship derby with a $5,000 prize. Next weekend, on his property. Without asking. Without acknowledgement. Without a shred of shame. Jake sat back, shaking his head in disbelief. He didn't need to imagine what Grandpa Sullivan would say. The answer would involve shotguns, shouting, and a colorful vocabulary. But Jake wasn't his grandfather. He was a strategist, a problem solver. The software engineer mindset kicked back in. He needed evidence, leverage, and allies. He called Emma Porter, his college friend turned environmental lawyer. She laughed outright when she heard the story. "Let me get this straight. You own the lake. Deed in your family's name. And the HOA is fining you for a boat on your lake? That about covers it. Jake, that's trespassing. Plain and simple. They're bluffing. Don't pay a dime. Document everything. Set cameras up, pull records, and give me the deeds. If they've been running tournaments on your property, we'll bury them legally. Just don't blink first. That night, Jake prowled the shoreline, fixing discreet wireless cameras at tree lines and paths. Motion detection synced to his phone. He retrieved decades-old deeds, maps clearly listing Sullivan ownership to water rights plus 15 feet of shoreline perimeter. He knew his ground was unshakable. But the HOA? They were acting with such entitlement, it meant one thing. They were building towards a larger con. The very next day, an email invitation popped up in his inbox. Maple Creek Estates HOA board meeting. Community Center, Tuesday evening. Curiosity tugged hard. If Richard Wilkins and his cronies were so confident in their authority, Jake wanted to see it firsthand. The community center looked like every overfunded suburban project. Faux columns, manicured fountain, sterile auditorium carpet. Jake slipped into the back row quietly among 30 or so board residents. At the podium, Richard Wilkins, silver-haired, blue blazer smug, gold button confidence dripping from his every motion. He rattled on about lawn height and mailbox design until he finally landed on lake regulations. There have been reports of an unauthorized boat being stored on community waters, Wilkins announced. All owners are reminded that watercraft must be registered with the HOA to meet visual guidelines. The lake is our community's jewel, and we must preserve its integrity. Jake raised his hand. The room rustled, surprised by the breach of protocol. Yes, gentlemen in the back. Jake stood, keeping his tone casual but sharp. Just a quick question. When you say community waters, who exactly owns the lake? A ripple of murmurs flowed through the hall. Nearby residents shifted curiously. Wilkins' smile flickered, then stiffened. The lake is under HOA management. It's always been a community resource, and do you have a deed for that? Jake pressed, innocent expression locked in place. Or is there an agreement with the county? Wilkins' hand tightened on the podium. There are historical arrangements. The specifics aren't relevant. The HOA has authority. Jake nodded thoughtfully. Interesting. Because according to county records, Sullivan Lake has been in my family since 1953. Deed and water rights. I'll gladly share copies if anyone's curious. Gasps. Whispers. Wilkins's composure cracked, his knuckles blanching as he gripped the podium. He fumbled through transition to the next agenda item, but the seed was planted. Residents were whispering, eyebrows raised, doubt creeping behind their eyes. Jake walked out before the meeting ended, but not before spotting HOA Vice President Karen Mitchell exchange a worried glance with Wilkins. The game had shifted. Later that evening, when Jake returned to his cabin, the confirmation of war arrived. His dock was bare. The boat gone. In its place was another neon notice. Boat impounded for non-compliance. Fine $750 plus compliance agreement required for return. Unclaimed property subject to auction in 30 days. Jake stood staring at the empty water, heart pounding with fury, but his mind was calm. This wasn't only about a boat. This was about arrogance, deception, trespass, and a decades-long plan by Wilkins' HOA vultures that had finally run into the wrong Sullivan. For the first time, Jake grinned. He had built a company by dismantling threats with strategy and precision. If the HOA thought they could bully him off his own lake, they had just made the most expensive mistake of their lives. The spark was lit, and Jake Sullivan was about to turn this HOA's power trip into their downfall. The morning after his boat vanished from the dock, Jake paced his cabin like a caged animal. Anger pulsed through him, but anger alone wasn't strategy. His grandfather's advice echoed in his mind. When you're angry, think clearer, not faster. So Jake sat down at the long wooden dining table, spread out the deeds and survey maps, and began organizing every scrap of paperwork he had. That's how Emma Porter found him when she arrived late that afternoon. Half-eaten pizza on one side of the table and stacks of dusty property documents on the other. Emma looked the same as she had since college. Sharp eyes, steady movements, a lawyer's cool confidence tempered with warmth. She removed her jacket, rolled up her sleeves, and set down a heavy briefcase. "Let's see what these clowns are trying to pull," she said, greeting him with a quick hug. Within minutes, Emma was flipping through deeds and legal maps, muttering to herself as she read aloud. 1953 deed transfer. Sullivan Family Trust. Water rights explicitly included. Defined perimeter. She leaned back at last and shook her head, half laughing. Jake, this is ironclad. You're not imagining it. You don't just own the cabin and shoreline. You own the entire lake bed, the water, and even a 15-foot stretch of shore beyond the waterline. The HOA has no jurisdiction. None. They've been trespassing for years. Jake felt both relief and fresh fury creep through his bones. So Wilkins and his goons are just bluffing? Emma raised one eyebrow. Not bluffing. Plotting. They know they have no authority, so they're trying to create the illusion of authority. If they can get you to sign something, even something as innocent as acknowledging their management, they'll twist it into leverage. And seeing how brazen they are, there's something bigger behind all this. As if on cue, Jake's phone buzzed. Ray Delgado's voice carried urgency on the other end. My niece works planning at the county. She saw a preliminary development application. Jake, they're trying to push through a luxury resort. Condos, marina, golf course, all of it wrapped around Sullivan Lake. Jake tightened his grip on the phone. Ray went on. They filed it as Maple Creek Estates Development, claiming they already control the water. If they get that approved, you're in for a war. After the call, Jake relayed everything to Emma. She didn't look surprised. There it is. The end game. They've been testing the waters, excuse the pun, with tournaments and fees, conditioning their residents to think Sullivan Lake is theirs. Meanwhile, they've been grooming investors. Your sudden reappearance threatens to collapse their entire foundation. That's why they're desperate now. That evening, they installed more cameras around the property, focusing on the shoreline where, according to the HOA website, the annual fishing tournament would soon take place. Jake activated the motion alerts to sync with his phone. The cameras would timestamp and record everything. Boats docking, tents being set up, members trespassing like it was their birthright. Evidence, Emma reminded him, was everything. 2 mornings later, Jake received a letter from the HOA's attorney, a slick 4-page packet from Barnes & Associates. It was filled with vague but pompous references to historic community precedent, collective management standards, and voluntary compliance agreements. Yet, tellingly, it cited no actual deed, ordinance, or law. Emma examined it and snorted. This kind of letter is designed to intimidate, not to win in court. If they had real authority, they'd be quoting case law. Instead, they're hoping you'll fold. We're not folding. She drafted a carefully worded response, short, polite, and utterly non-committal. The kind of letter that said, we're watching, we're not afraid, and we're buying time. That afternoon, Jake met with journalist Sarah Lynn at a quiet cafe out of sight from HOA eyes. She was younger than he expected, mid-30s with a journalist's intensity. Sharp eyes, quick pen, hungry for truth. Jake laid out enough of the story to hook her. The letters, the trespassing tournaments, the stolen boat. The resort scheme whispered through county files. Sarah leaned forward. This isn't just an HOA dispute. This could be fraud on a massive scale. Misuse of member funds, misrepresentation to investors, illegal use of private property. HOA residents think they're paying for lake rights they don't actually have. If I can uncover proof of where that money went, this could blow wide open. Jake asked her to wait to publish until the tournament weekend. He wanted the evidence to be undeniable. She agreed, promising to dig into Richard Wilkins's background in the meantime. Jake didn't have to wait long to see the other side push harder. The next morning, Richard Wilkins himself appeared at Jake's door, casual clothes instead of his usual blazer, trying and failing to look relaxed. He smiled without warmth as Jake opened the door. Mr. Sullivan, I think we've gotten off on the wrong foot. Jake let him in, curious. Richard spoke with polished sentences, each word measured. The HOA is prepared to allow you to keep your rustic vessel on the lake, if you'll sign this simple memorandum acknowledging Maple Creek Estates management rights. He slid a sleek document across the coffee table. Jake skimmed it. The language was slick, full of innocuous phrases about cooperation, but its core demanded acknowledgement of HOA control over Sullivan Lake. In black and white, it was an attempted land grab disguised as compromise. Jake looked up, masking his fury behind calm curiosity. Would this also apply to your fishing tournaments? Richard's eyes narrowed imperceptibly. You know about those? Jake shrugged. Gerald Thompson invited me to one. Sounds like quite an event. Richard forced a chuckle. Yes, a proud community tradition, which is why it's important not to get bogged down in technicalities. Then, his tone dropped a fraction lower. There are economic opportunities here, Mr. Sullivan. Opportunities that could benefit you personally. If you're willing to be cooperative, there it was, the bribe behind the threats. Jake smiled thinly and handed the document back. I'll have my lawyer look at it. In the meantime, I'll be expecting my boat returned. Richard stood, mask slipping for the briefest second into scowl before he recovered. I hope this doesn't escalate unnecessarily, he said stiffly. And with that, he walked out, leaving the air heavy with unspoken menace. When Jake relayed the encounter to Emma, she wasn't surprised. Classic. Intimidation, then bribery, then veiled threats. They overplayed their hand. They gave us exactly what we needed. Proof they know they have no claim. As the sun went down, Jake stood on the dock staring at the empty space where his boat once floated. This was bigger than a boat, bigger than tournaments, even bigger than a resort sham. This was about his grandfather's legacy. One man who had given his final decades to protect this water from corporate greed. And now Jake realized the torch was his. Emma was right, it was no bluff. Richard Wilkins and his cronies were plotting, and their deadline echoed in Jake's ears. Deal with the Sullivan situation before it's too late. Well, Richard, Jake muttered into the twilight glow, fists tightening into resolve. I think it's already too late. For you. The morning of the tournament broke warm and clean, sunlight glittering off Sullivan Lake like sheets of glass. From the deck of his cabin, Jake sipped his coffee and watched with binoculars as the invasion began. First one truck with a sleek base boat, then another, then a caravan. By mid-morning, the eastern shoreline buzzed like a county fairground. SUVs pulled in with polished boats on trailers. Anglers in $400 fishing shirts strutted as though they owned the place. And teenagers hammered tent pegs into the soft earth where Jake's grandfather once taught him to fish with a bamboo cane. Next came the spectacle. A massive banner stretched across two poles, boldly declaring, 15th Annual Elite Anglers Championship, presented by Maple Creek Estates HOA. Beneath it, tables of catered food appeared, coolers brimmed with beer, and even a makeshift bar popped up near the trees. To Jake, it looked surreal. These people claiming dominion over his family's land with such confidence, such arrogance, that spectators lining the shore had no clue they were trespassing en masse. His phone buzzed with one of the wireless cameras pinging motion alerts. He opened the live feed. Every angle documented boats slipping into his lake, dozens of strangers using what legally was still Sullivan property. Evidence time-stamped and recorded in high definition. Emma arrived just before noon, her dark sunglasses masking the same simmering fury that Jake felt. They're not even pretending, she said flatly as she watched cluster after cluster of families setting up folding chairs on his shoreline. There have to be 50 people here at least. Closer to 60, Jake said, scanning with his binoculars. Then something caught his eye. A group approaching in immaculate suits, portfolios in hand. Not fishermen, investors. Richard Wilkins himself strode proudly at the center, his blazer catching the light, leading them like a tour guide through stolen land. Gerald Thompson, the Anglers Club president, shadowed them faithfully, gesturing proudly at temporary docks and barbecue pits. The image made Jake's hands tighten into fists. Here's our proof, he muttered. They moved closer, careful to remain hidden in the tree line on their own property. Now they could hear Wilkins's honeyed tones as he pitched to the investors. As you can see, Maple Creek Estates controls the entirety of the waterfront. The community has exclusive rights to the lake, which has been managed under HOA authority for years. What we're proposing is expansion, a luxury resort complex here on the East Shore. Prime location, golf course, condos overlooking the water, a marina for residents and guests. He handed glossy brochures to the women and men in suits, their eyes scanning sleek architectural renderings depicting towers and docks where Jake's grandfather once tied up nets. Any existing property complications? One investor asked. Minimal, Wilkins replied smoothly. There's one holdout, but negotiations are in progress. It will be resolved. The words made Jake grit his teeth. Negotiations? He hadn't negotiated anything except the return of his stolen boat. He watched as Wilkins gestured across the water as though giving away Jake's bloodline. Emma quietly lifted her camera and clicked shots in rapid succession. We've got him. Documenting lies directly to investors. 2 hours later, while barbecues smoked and laughter rang across an audience of trespassers, Emma was on the phone with the county courthouse. Her legal connections worked fast. Equipped with titles proving ownership, security footage, and photographs of Wilkins pitching false claims, she filed for an emergency injunction. Judge Harmon, reviewing the clear ownership deeds and noting the ongoing violation, signed the order. That injunction was the legal hammer they needed. Immediate relief against further unauthorized use of Sullivan Lake. By late afternoon, Jake walked toward the tournament grounds, accompanied by Emma and a county sheriff's deputy in uniform. The deputy carried copies of the injunction and spoke in a commanding voice as the crowd hushed in confusion. Attention, everyone. This assembly is taking place on private property. The owner, Mr. Jake Sullivan, has not authorized this event. A court injunction has been issued ordering trespassers to vacate immediately. Stunned silence held for only a moment before Gerald Thompson stormed forward, face red. Outrageous, he bellowed. We've held this tournament for 15 years. The HOA has always authorized it. Emma calmly stepped forward, her tone steady with razor-sharp professionalism. The Maple Creek HOA has never had any legal authority over Sullivan Lake. The property deeds show full ownership belongs to Mr. Sullivan continuously since 1953. This injunction confirms it. Every person here today has been trespassing, misled by the false claims of Mr. Wilkins and his associates. She held the document high so everyone could see the raised seal of the court. The crowd rippled with anger and confusion. Neighbors muttered about HOA fees, lake maintenance payments on their dues, and lies they'd been told for years. One man stepped out from the crowd. Are you saying we've been paying for lake access in our HOA fees? Thousands of dollars every year? That's exactly what she's saying, another resident growled, turning toward Wilkins. Eyebrows furrowed. Realization spread. Suddenly, the real victims realized they weren't Jake. They were the paying residents strung along by false authority. The investors, sensing disaster, began swiftly retreating toward their vehicles. Richard Wilkins's face blanched as he noticed them slipping away, murmuring angrily at each other. He lunged forward, waving his arms. This is ridiculous. The HOA has authority. We've maintained this lake as a community jewel for decades. His voice cracked, desperation leaking through the veneer. Emma handed him a copy of the property deed. Demonstrably false, Mr. Wilkins. Every inch of Sullivan Lake belonged to the Sullivan family since the 1950s. You've been misrepresenting your position to residents and investors alike. That is fraud. Richard's charismatic mask shattered. The vein in his temple pulsed visibly. He leaned closer to Jake, his voice a seething whisper no longer carrying leaderly calm. You have no idea who you're messing with, Sullivan. I have connections in this county you couldn't imagine. Jake met his eyes coolly. I used to negotiate with billion-dollar corporations for breakfast, Richard. I'm not scared of a small-town grifter in a blazer. And unlike you, I have the truth. Plus cameras. He tapped his phone, which had been recording the entire exchange. Behind them, the sheriff's deputy raised his voice again. Folks, start packing up. Court says this is private property. We'll be enforcing. Slowly at first, then steadily. Boats were pulled from the water, tents dismantled, grills extinguished. Disgruntled residents muttered. Others shot venomous looks at their once trusted board. We've been scammed, one woman snapped, her voice carrying across the murmurs. Wilkins tried one more time, attempting a last smile, his investors' cars disappearing down the road in glittering lines of brake lights. This was just a misunderstanding. I'm sure we can work something out amicably. Jake cut him off with icy calm. The time for working things out was before you stole my boat, claimed my lake, and tried to sell property you don't own. It's over. By dusk, the eastern shore was empty except for a few stragglers shaking their heads in disbelief. The massive banner had been rolled up, the grills packed away. Where hours before had been a festival of arrogant trespassing, now sat silence. Jake stood on the dock, Emma by his side, watching as the last trailer disappeared down the road. The battle wasn't entirely won. Not yet. Retaliation would come. Fraud didn't collapse in one day, but Jake could feel deep in his chest that the tide had turned. His grandfather's lake had been reclaimed, at least for now. And tomorrow, Richard Wilkins and his HOA would answer not simply to Jake Sullivan, but to every single resident they'd deceived. For the first time in weeks, Jake breathed deeply, watching the lake return to peace. His own peace. The battle lines were clear, and he was ready for whatever came next. The eastern shore of Sullivan Lake was quiet again the next morning, but the echoes of outrage and betrayal from the previous day still rang across Maple Creek Estates. Jake stood on his dock, sipping his coffee, watching his grandfather's water ripple calm and clean. For the first time since the neon orange violation notice had appeared, he felt the strange, exhilarating sense that momentum had shifted. Richard Wilkins's investors had fled, the tournament had collapsed in public shame, and the residents who once parroted HOA rules were now whispering with suspicion about where their money had been going. Jake knew it wasn't over. In many ways, it was just beginning. Corruption never fell quietly. It screamed as it hit the ground. That scream came swiftly. Sarah Lynn's article hit front pages the following day. HOA fraud exposed. Maple Creek Estates lied about lake ownership while plotting luxury resort. It spread like fire through the county, then through regional outlets, with photos of Wilkins red-faced at the tournament alongside quotes from deceived residents. Her sharp pen turned their years of manipulation into ink. Misuse of dues, fabricating community rights, trespassing, and a resort scheme built on lies. Within hours of the newspapers landing in driveways, calls flooded the HOA office. Some were furious residents demanding answers. Others were state officials asking questions that Richard Wilkins could no longer charm his way out of. Emma was already 3 steps ahead. She had filed a formal complaint with the county prosecutor, attaching every deed, survey map, security video, and transcript, weaved neatly into a timeline. The prosecutor, under mounting media pressure, publicly announced an investigation into HOA finances and potential criminal fraud. That announcement struck at the heart of Maple Creek like a stone through glass. An emergency HOA meeting was called 2 days later. Jake attended quietly, standing with Emma at the back as the small auditorium overflowed with residents, some carrying crumpled copies of Sarah's article, others waving their past-due fees in fistfuls. Karen Mitchell, the vice president, stood nervously at the podium in Wilkins's absence, trying desperately to calm the crowd. Richard had prior commitments, she hedged, her voice faltering. Murmurs of "convenient" and "where's our money" rolled through the hall like thunder. One resident, a middle-aged father in a fishing vest, shouted from the second row, "You told us we paid for lake maintenance for years. If the HOA never owned the lake, where did the money go?" His question lit the fuse. Others stood, demanded resignations, waved fee statements, hurled accusations. Karen wilted under the questions, retreating further and further into vague platitudes about community stewardship, until finally she cracked. "Perhaps some mistakes were made, but I had no idea Richard was not fully forthcoming." She cut herself short too late. Every eye sharpened, Emma leaned toward Jake. "She's going down with him, watch." Resignations began mid-meeting. A treasurer who couldn't account for maintenance expenses. A secretary who admitted she simply signed whatever was placed in front of her. Karen tried to regain control, but the fury in the room overwhelmed her. No one cheered when multiple board members walked out. The residents felt robbed, not relieved. But the implosion was clear. The empire Wilkins had built, brick by fraudulent brick, was collapsing in a storm of unpaid trust. By the week's end, Sarah called Jake with the bombshell. "We dug into Wilkins's past. He's not even Richard Wilkins. He's Richard Williams, a developer out of Florida who had his real estate license revoked for nearly identical scams. Selling access to property he didn't own, fudging HOA funds, misusing community dues. He fled to Massachusetts, rebranded, and started over." Jake sat stunned in his cabin while Sarah relayed the details. It explained everything. The polished smile, the slick historical arrangement claims, the habit of intimidation followed by bribery. He was a fraudster, a professional parasite. And now, once again, he'd been exposed. Sarah ended with a smirk audible even through the phone. "The prosecutor's office is salivating now. Look for fraud and misappropriation charges filed as early as next month." Sure enough, Richard Wilkins, or Williams, vanished almost overnight, leaving his once loyal vice president and a scattering of abandoned board members to field a tsunami of subpoenas. Residents muttered about seeing him pack his BMW late one night and speeding out of town. Jake didn't care. He knew predators eventually slink into shadow when their mask shatters. What mattered wasn't chasing Wilkins. It was rebuilding what he tried to burn. The residents requested Jake speak at the next gathering. He stood before them, not as adversary, but as the owner of the lake they had been denied truthful access to. He remembered his grandfather's voice as he spoke. "I don't have a problem with families enjoying the water," Jake told them plainly. "I have a problem with people lying about who they are and stealing what they don't own. My grandfather believed this lake wasn't just for one man, but a community that respected it. If we're going to move forward, it has to be with honesty this time. It has to honor what he protected." Heads nodded. The tension in the room quieted into thought. One older gentleman raised his hand and introduced himself as Michael Davis, a retired judge. He volunteered to lead a new interim board to replace the wreckage of Wilkins' cabal. With his fair reputation, the residents quickly voted him in. Davis met Jake afterward with a firm handshake. "I knew your grandfather," he said with a smile softened by memory. "He had a way of cutting through nonsense. I think he'd be proud of how you handled this." Together, Jake, Emma, and Davis drafted the foundation for something better. The Sullivan Lake Conservation Trust, a nonprofit partnership marrying Jake's private ownership rights with controlled public access. Residents who wished to fish or enjoy the shoreline could purchase affordable annual passes, the funds going directly toward maintenance, conservation, and protections outlined transparently in public records. Part of the eastern shore, the very site Richard had wanted paved over for condos, was set aside as a small public park with a picnic area and fishing pier. Families could gather there under rules rooted in respect instead of greed. For the first time in years, the lake looked not stolen, not controlled, but tended. Gerlad Thompson, furious at losing his exclusive elite anglers fiefdom, packed up and left the community for good. But younger families embraced the new arrangement almost immediately. Less exclusivity, more honesty, all without pocketing hidden fees. The new Sullivan Lake Anglers Club became inclusive and conservation-focused, inviting kids of all ages to learn fishing ethics, echoing Henry Sullivan's old lessons to local children half a century ago. The county prosecutor's office indicted Wilkins Williams on multiple counts within a month: fraud, misrepresentation, misappropriation of HOA funds. Residents who once followed him blindly now lined up to testify, producing years of fee statements soaked in lies. Facing mountains of evidence and his Florida record unearthed, Richard's career had ended not in victory, but exile and indictment. Jake retrieved his grandfather's boat soon after. The HOA's fine was voided, but Jake deliberately left the boat rustic, repairing but never modernizing it. Paint dulled, wood worn smooth by decades of palms. The boat wasn't pretty by HOA standards, but it was beautiful by Sullivan standards. On warm, early mornings, Jake would take it out to the middle of the lake, sip fresh coffee, and breathe. Some mornings Ray would join, cracking jokes about how Henry Sullivan would have solved the HOA problem with less paperwork and more shotguns. Other mornings, Jake went alone, trailing his hand through the water as if to feel Henry's grip in its cool surface. The framed photograph came last. Dug from an old album, it showed his grandfather grinning wide, holding a massive bass by the gills with the same boat floating behind him. Jake hung it above the cabin's mantel, directly across from the view of the lake itself. It became his compass, his reminder, not just that he had won, but that he had kept the lake safe for others without letting anger poison him. As summer bloomed over Sullivan Lake, the water seemed clearer than it had in years. Wildlife abundant, laughter rising from children fishing off the new public pier. The no trespassing signs were gone, replaced by Sullivan Conservation Area plaques that both acknowledged Jake's ownership and invited respect for the shared treasure. The villagers whispered that the lake felt different. It wasn't fear anymore. It was stewardship. Sometimes Jake smiled at the irony. The HOA tyrants had wanted to turn his lake into luxury condos. Instead, they forced him to rediscover his grandfather's lesson once more. Water is life. Respect it, and it takes care of everything else. That was justice. That was renewal. And as Jake floated in his small rustic boat, sipping coffee under pink skies shimmering across his family's water, he knew the legacy would outlast him. Outlast Richard Wilkins. Outlast HOA greed, outlast everything but the lake itself.